Hey guys, here's the next installment of videos for our lessons. As you can see by the title, we're going to talk about fraction benchmarks today. In a previous lesson, I covered the idea of comparing fractions when you have the same numerator or same denominator. But in this one, we're going to talk about when you're comparing more than two fractions, maybe 3 fractions, 4 fractions, or 5 fractions. And using this idea of a benchmark and trying to decide, is your given fraction closer to the benchmark of 0? The benchmark of 1/2 or the benchmark of 1 is really going to help you compare and eventually put the fractions in order from least to greatest or greatest to least. So let's get into the video and look at a few examples. I'm going to start off with two simple fractions. Maybe we'll start with 1/3 and we'll start with 6/8. Now, in these two fractions, you probably realize we don't have the same numerator. On one side we have the numerator of 1, and in the other fraction we have a numerator of 6. So we can't just say, well, 6 is bigger than 1, the fraction's bigger. We need to look at our denominators. So one denominator over here is a 3, denominator on the other side is an 8. So they're not the same, so we can't just say, oh, we need to look at the numerators. This is what's called mixed fractions. We don't have the same numerators, we don't have the same denominators. So what we're going to try to do is think of a number line, think of benchmarks, as I just mentioned, the benchmark of 0, the benchmark of 1/2, and the benchmark of 1/2. And we're going to try to decide where on a number line would we put our fractions. Are they less than 1/2 or are they more than 1/2? And that's really the key to the whole understanding here. And what you have to try to decide is, we'll look at this one first, we'll look at the fraction 1/3. In that fraction of 1/3, we have to figure out, is that less than 1/2 or is it more than 1/2, right? In the middle here, we'll put the fraction 1/2 so we can see this. Use that as an example. And in the previous chats we talked about, we said in the fraction 1/2, we said when your numerator is half of your denominator, the fraction's equal to 1/2. In this case, 1 is half of 2, so 1/2, of course, equals 1/2. But when we look at this fraction on the left over here, of 1/3, you use the same strategy or the same mentality. You think, okay, is my numerator up here, my numerator of 1, is 1 half of 3? Well, 1 isn't half of 3, so then you have to decide, okay, is 1 more than half of 3 or less than half of 3? Well, half of 3 would be 1 1/2, and I'm only at 1, which means 1/3 is less than 1/2. Okay, when we look at our other fraction over here, our fraction of 6/8, we try to decide the same thing. We look at our numerator, and in this case our numerator is 6. We already talked about that. Our denominator is 8, and we have to ask ourselves, is 6, our numerator of 6, is that more or less than half of 8? Well, what is half of 8? 4. 6 is more than 4, so this fraction would be more than 1/2. Really, if you can get to that point, deciding if a fraction is less than 1/2 or more than 1/2, will really help you order them. Then if we put those two fractions on a number line, 1/3 would be on this side of 1/2, 6/8 would be on this side of 1/2, and then on our number line we can say 1/3 is closer to 0, and 6/8 is closer to 1/2. That tells me that the fraction 6/8 is going to be bigger. So we're going to look at another one, except this time I'm going to draw some pictures. And this time we'll go with a fraction of 3/4. And you might already be looking at that thinking about what I just told you. Oh, is my numerator more or less than half of my denominator? Well, in this case, my numerator of 3, right, we have a numerator up here of 3. We have a denominator, in this case, of 4. And you could ask yourself, okay, what is half of 4? 2. 3 is more than 2, so this fraction is, in fact, greater than 1/2. So 3/4, we could say, is greater than 1/2. And here's what it would look like in pictures. If we draw fraction bars, and you know I'm a fan of using fraction bars, 2 equal-sized fraction bars. I want to make sure my whole is the same. First one was split in half. That one's pretty easy. We've been over this a lot. That's 1/2 represented in a fraction bar. The top fraction bar I'm going to represent 3/4. And in this case, we need 4 equal intervals. Okay. You might notice here my middle line, if that extended down, it would be even with the half line below, so it shows my intervals are right. And in this case, I need to mark off 3/4. So here's 1/4, here's 2/4, here's 3/4. Right? That fraction, you can see, is indeed bigger than 1/2. So using this strategy of trying to figure out, is your numerator, top number, bigger or smaller than half of your denominator, that will tell you if your fraction is bigger or smaller than the fraction 1/2. Let's look at a few more examples. Let's go with the fraction 2/3. Ask yourself, is that more or less than 1/2? Is my numerator of 2 more or less than half of my denominator? Well, what's half of 3? Half of 3 would be 1 and 1/2. 2 is bigger than 1 and 1/2, so 2/3, you can write it like this, is greater than 1/2. Right? How about if we had the fraction 6/12? Well, you could ask yourself, your numerator of 6, is that more or less than half of my denominator? Well, what is half of my denominator? My denominator is 12. What's half of 12? If you're not sure, you could always divide 12 by 2, right? 12 divided by 2. That means you're splitting it into 2 equal groups. 12 divided by 2 is 6. Wait a minute. My numerator is half of my denominator. What does that mean? Oh, that's right. That means 6/12 is equal to 1/2. Don't get tricked as the numerators and denominators get bigger. Just keep in mind the strategy. If your numerator is more than half of your denominator, your fraction is bigger than 1/2. If your numerator is less than half of your denominator, your fraction is less than 1/2. So I'll give you one to practice with. Let's go with the fraction 3/8. You decide, is this fraction more than 1/2 or is this fraction less than 1/2? Go ahead and pause the video, try to work it out, and I'll give you the answer in a moment. Okay, by now you had a chance to pause the video. What we're trying to figure out here is 3/8 compared to 1/2. Is it more than 1/2 or less than 1/2? Well, if you look at your numerator, you have to ask yourself, is that number more or less than half of your denominator? What is half of my denominator? Well, if I split 8 in half, I would have 4 and 4. 4 plus 4 is 8. That means 4 would be half of 8. 3 is less than half of my denominator, which we said is 4. 3 is less than 4. That means my fraction of 3/8 is less than 1/2. Keep this in mind as we get into the lesson today, and it will definitely help you order and compare fractions. See you in a bit.